In the early morning fog of November 1944, the Allied advance slowed to a crawl along a battered stretch of countryside near the French-German border. The land looked quiet, almost innocent, but every step forward carried the threat of buried death. Sergeant Daniel Walker moved carefully, his boots sinking into cold mud, his attention fixed on the German shepherd beside him. Ajax was trained for this work: methodical, precise, fearless. He had saved lives before. That morning, however, the air felt different. Heavy with a tension Daniel could not explain. Ajax suddenly stopped. Not the sharp alert bark, not the practiced signal taught during months of training, but a complete and unnatural stillness. His body locked, ears angled forward, breathing shallow. Daniel's heart stuttered. Commands echoed uselessly in his mind as he raised a hand, signaling the men behind him to halt. A single step forward could mean annihilation, yet Ajax did not indicate a mine the way he was trained to. He simply refused to move, eyes fixed on the soil as if listening to something beneath it. From the temporary medical post behind the line, Lieutenant Margaret Maggie Hale noticed the delay. She had learned to recognize silence on the battlefield, the kind that meant danger rather than calm. Curious and uneasy, she stepped closer, stopping just short of the cordoned area. She saw Daniel kneeling slowly, his hand hovering over the dog's neck, not touching. There was something intimate in the gesture, almost reverent. Maggie had treated dozens of wounded handlers, but she had never seen one look at a dog the way this man did. Daniel whispered Ajax's name, not as an order, but as a player. Memories surged, uninvited training camps, explosions, a night months earlier when a different dog had missed a device and paid the price. He had promised himself never to hesitate again. Yet now, every instinct told him to trust Ajax completely. The dog's muscles trembled, not with fear, but restraint. Daniel felt it then. Ajax wasn't detecting metal. He was reacting to something else. Something wrong. Maggie took another step forward before she could stop herself. "He's trying to tell you something," she said softly. Daniel looked up, startled, their eyes meeting across the dangerous ground. For a brief moment, the war receded. Maggie saw exhaustion etched into his face, but also devotion raw and unguarded. Daniel saw concern in her expression, not curiosity, the kind that came from someone who had seen too much loss already. Neither spoke again, yet the connection settled heavily between them. Engineers were called in. Time stretched painfully as they cleared the area inch by inch. They found a mine, yes, but beneath it, deeper than expected, lay something that made the men fall silent. Human remains, long buried, shifting the soil in ways no manual accounted for. Ajax had sensed what machines could not. As the truth surfaced, Daniel's grip tightened on the dog, while Maggie watched, realizing this moment would change far more than their mission. And somewhere within that frozen field, a deeper story had only begun to surface. The discovery beneath the frozen soil spread quietly through the unit, carried in hushed voices rather than official reports. The remains were carefully marked and removed, treated with a respect that felt heavier than protocol. For Sergeant Daniel Walker, the field no longer looked like terrain on a map. It felt haunted. Ajax stayed close to his side, unusually silent, as if aware that whatever he had uncovered was not finished speaking. Daniel avoided looking back, afraid that if he did, he would see more than mud and markers. Lieutenant Maggie Hale couldn't shake the image of the handler kneeling beside his dog. It followed her back to the medical tent, lingering between bandages and blood-stained gloves. She told herself it was nothing, just another moment in a war full of them. Yet something about Daniel's restraint, the way he had trusted the animal over his own training, unsettled her. That night, as she wrote casualty notes by lantern light, she found herself wondering what kind of man listened that closely in a place built on noise and chaos. Daniel barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Ajax frozen in place, muscles taut, refusing to obey. Regulations echoed in his head. Dogs were assets, tools of war. But Ajax had never felt like that to him. He remembered the early days of training, the quiet intelligence in the dog's eyes, the bond formed without words. Somewhere between explosions and orders, Ajax had become his anchor. And now, Daniel feared that bond was about to be tested in ways neither of them were prepared for. The next morning, Maggie was assigned to move closer to the advance, her medical unit repositioned near the handlers and engineers. The decision was purely strategic, yet it felt personal. When she arrived, Daniel was there, brushing mud from Ajax's coat with a care that bordered on tenderness. Their eyes met again, awkward this time. Both unsure what to say after sharing something so intense without introductions. Maggie broke the silence first, asking about the dog's condition. Daniel answered simply, his voice guarded. As they spoke, a third present approached Captain Robert Hayes, an engineer officer known for his calm authority. He praised Ajax's instincts, calling the discovery remarkable. But his eyes lingered on Maggie longer than necessary, his familiarity unmistakable. Daniel noticed immediately, a sharp, irrational discomfort tightening his chest. Maggie, for her part, stiffened subtly. Hayes represented safety, structure, a world she knew. Daniel represented uncertainty, instinct, and something dangerously unspoken. The contrast unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. That afternoon, new orders arrived. Ajax and Daniel were reassigned to a forward reconnaissance mission faster, with less margin for error. Maggie overheard the briefing, her stomach sinking as she realized the terrain matched the conditions of the frozen field. She looked for Daniel, wanting to say anything, but he was already preparing to move out. As Ajax stepped forward, alert yet hesitant, Maggie felt a sudden certainty settle in her chest. Whatever the dog had sensed before was not over, and this time the cost might be far greater. The march toward the forward zone was slower than expected, each step measured against the memory of what lay hidden beneath the earth. Daniel felt the weight of command heavier than his pack, his eyes constantly returning to Ajax's posture, his breathing, the subtle shifts that only a handler could read. The landscape looked deceptively frosted grass, broken fences, a pale sky, but Daniel knew better now. This ground kept secrets, and Ajax, more than any map or metal detector, had proven he could hear them. Ajax moved with caution, nose low, tail rigid, but his behavior had changed since the discovery. He paused more often, head tilting as if listening rather than searching. Daniel felt a knot tighten in his chest. Training manuals offered no guidance for this. Dogs were taught to find explosives, not memories buried in soil. Yet every instinct told him Ajax was responding to something real, something human. Ignoring it would be easier. Trusting it felt dangerous but necessary. Back at the medical station, Maggie tried to focus on her duties, but her thoughts drifted relentlessly forward. She knew the terrain they were entering. She had treated soldiers pulled from those fields, some alive, some not. Captain Hayes noticed her distraction immediately, offering reassurance wrapped in authority. He spoke of probabilities, of controlled risks. Maggie nodded politely, but his words slid past her. Numbers didn't explain the look she had seen in Daniel's eyes, or the way Ajax had frozen, as if refusing to let history repeat itself. As dusk approached, the unit halted near a cluster of abandoned farm buildings. Orders came to sweep the area before nightfall. Daniel unclipped Ajax's leash, giving him room to work. The dog advanced a few steps, then stopped again. Not frozen this time, he circled once, then sat abruptly, ears pinned back. Daniel's breath caught. This was not a trained response. This was defiance. Murmurs rippled through the men. A dog that refused to work was a liability. A radio crackled with urgency. Higher command wanted speed. Daniel felt the pressure close in from all sides. He knelt beside Ajax, lowering his voice, blocking out the world. "Show me," he whispered, not an order, but an invitation. Ajax stood slowly, walked several yards off the expected path, and stopped beside a collapsed wall. Daniel followed, heart pounding beneath the ruble. Engineers uncovered more remains this time recent. Civilians. The realization hit hard, stealing the air from the men's lungs. When word reached Maggie, she arrived just as the last body was removed. The scene was quiet, reverent. She caught Daniel's eye across the clearing, seeing both relief and fear etched into his expression. He had trusted Ajax. Egan had been right, but the implications were terrifying. Someone had buried civilians, beneath a minefield. Someone had turned the ground itself into a warning. Maggie stepped closer, instinctively reaching out, then stopping herself inches away from Daniel's arm. That night, as the camp settled into uneasy silence, new intelligence arrive maps, marked with symbols that shouldn't exist. Routes that led straight through populated areas. Maggie and Daniel stood over the documents together. Tension thick between them. Ajax lay at their feet, eyes open, alert. Whatever pattern he had uncovered was growing larger, darker, and as Maggie realized the truth might implicate Allied decisions, not just enemy cruelty, she understood one thing with chilling clarity. Uncovering it would cost more than lives. It would cost loyalty. Morning arrived without comfort. A gray sky pressed low over the camp, mirroring the weight that had settled into every conversation. The map spread across the command table told a story no one wanted to read aloud. Routes marked as cleared crossed directly through villages now known to be buried beneath unstable ground. Daniel stood rigid beside the table, Ajax at his heel, while officers debated language error, oversight, necessary risk. None of the words explained the bodies Ajax had found, or the quiet accusation etched into the dog's stillness. Maggie listened from the edge of the tent, arms folded tightly across her chest. As a nurse, she was trained to treat outcomes, not causes. But this was different. She recognized the pattern now. Decisions made far from the field, translated into neat symbols, then paid for in blood. Captain Hayes spoke calmly, professionally, defending the strategy with practiced precision. Maggie felt something fracture inside her as she realized he already knew. Or worse, he had chosen not to ask. Their shared past suddenly felt heavier, tainted by silence. Daniel was dismissed with orders to prepare Ajax for another sweep. Outside, he crouched beside the dog, resting his forehead briefly against Ajax's strong neck. "You did good," he murmured, voice low. Ajax leaned into him, steady and grounding. Daniel had followed orders his entire career, believing structure kept chaos at bay. But now he understood something had shifted. Ajax wasn't just detecting danger, was revealing truth. And truth, Daniel knew, rarely came without consequences. Later that afternoon, Maggie found Daniel alone near the perimeter, cleaning mud from Ajax's paws. The air between them felt charged, heavy with things unsaid. She thanked him for trusting the dog, for slowing the advance, for giving the dead a voice. Daniel looked up at her, surprised by the intensity in her eyes. For a moment, the war receded again, replaced by something fragile and human. He wanted to tell her everything about his doubts, his fears, the guilt he carried, but restraint held him back. Their closeness did not go unnoticed. Captain Hayes watched from a distance, jaw tight, his expression unreadable. When he later confronted Maggie, his tone was measured but sharp. He warned her about attachments, about lines that shouldn't be crossed in wartime. Maggie bristled, anger and disappointment colliding. She saw clearly now what she had once ignored. Hayes believed in order above all else, even when that order demanded silence. And silence, she realized, was a choice she could no longer make. That night, new orders arrived classified, urgent, sealed. Ajax and Daniel were to be transferred to a different sector, one marked in red on the map. Maggie read the location and felt her breath catch. It was the same area referenced in the disputed reports, the same ground where the truth had been buried. She looked for Daniel, urgency burning through her chest, but he was already preparing to leave. As Ajax stood alert beside him, Maggie understood with painful clarity. This separation was not coincidence. It was containment, and whatever waited in that sector was something powerful enough to demand it. The transfer order fractured the fragile rhythm Daniel had begun to trust. At dawn, trucks waited with engines idling, exhaust curling into the cold air like unanswered questions. The red-marked sector lay farther east, closer to contested ground, where mistakes were buried as quickly as Daniel packed in silence, Ajax watching every movement with focused calm. He felt the familiar pull of duty tightened around his chest, but beneath it stirred something new and awareness that this assignment wasn't about progress. It was about distance. Distance from what Ajax kept uncovering. Maggie arrived too late to stop the convoy, but early enough to say goodbye. She found Daniel near the last truck, fastening Ajax's harness with careful hands. The moment stretched, heavy with restraint. She wanted to warn him about the reports, about Hayes's influence, about the way truth was being managed. Instead, she said his name, and the sound of it seemed to surprise them both. Daniel looked up, eyes searching her face as if memorizing it. Enot unse. A promise without words. The road east was unforgiving. Shell-scarred fields gave way to forests stripped bare by winter. The ground churned and restless. Ajax worked steadily, but his behavior grew increasingly deliberate, as if choosing where to focus rather than responding automatically. Daniel trusted him more than ever now. He remembered a handler's old saying, "Dogs don't lie, people do." The phrase echoed with unsettling clarity. Each pause Ajax took felt like a question directed at Daniel alone. "Are you listening?" Bycat Kemb, Maggie confronted Hayes. She spoke calmly, deliberately, demanding clarity about the red sector and the sudden transfer. Hayes didn't deny the risks. He reframed them acceptable, necessary. When Maggie pressed, he warned her gently about consequences. Careers ended quietly in wartime. Reputations dissolved without a trace. Maggie left the conversation shaken but resolved. She had chosen medicine to save lives, not to justify losses. And if silence protected systems instead of people, she wanted no part of it. At the new sector, Ajax halted beside a shallow ravine, choked with debris. Not frozen to Daniel signaled the engineers and waited. Beneath the loose earth, they found remnants of explosives wired irregularly, mixed with personal items. A child's shoe, a scarf. The implication was immediate and sickening. This wasn't defensive mining. It was deterrence. Daniel felt anger flare, sharp and focused. Ajax had led them again not to metal, but to meaning. And meaning was dangerous. That night, Daniel wrote a report he knew would be altered. He considered rewriting it, softening the language. Instead, he sent it raw, factual, undeniable. Across miles of darkness, Maggie studied a copy that reached her through unofficial channels. Their eyes would never meet in that moment, but the connection held. Ajax lay awake at Daniel's feet, alert to sounds no one else could hear. Somewhere beyond the perimeter, movement stirred, and as the radio crackled with a new directive, Daniel understood the cost of listening had just gone up. The consequences arrived faster than Daniel expected. By morning, his report had been flagged, questioned, and quietly rewritten. An officer he barely recognized pulled him aside, speaking in careful tones about procedure and perception. There was no accusation, only implication. Daniel listened, jaw tight. Ajax pressed against his leg, as if sensing the shift in air. The message was clear. Continue the mission, but stop asking the wrong questions. Daniel nodded, knowing compliance would be observed more closely than defiance. Miles away, Maggie felt the same tightening net. Her access to records narrowed overnight, familiar names replaced with redacted lines. Captain Hayes avoided her, delegating communication through intermediaries. The silence was louder than any confrontation. Maggie recognized the tactic immediately: distance, isolation, exhaustion. It was meant to wear her down. Instead, it sharpened her resolve. She began keeping her own notes, handwritten and hidden, cross-referencing dates, locations, and casualties that no longer aligned with official explanations. In the field, Ajax's behavior grew more complex. He no longer reacted simply to scent or sound. He anticipated. At one clearing, he refused to advance, circling instead, pulling Daniel away from a marked route. Minutes later, an explosion erupted where they would have walked. The men stared in stunned silence. There was no mine there on the map. Daniel felt a chill crawled up his spine. Ajax wasn't just detecting danger, he was mapping intention. Someone had redesigned the battlefield after the reports were filed. That night, Daniel broke protocol. Using a borrowed radio frequency, he sent a brief message encoded in routine supply language coordinates, patterns, anomalies. He didn't sign it. He didn't have to. Maggie understood immediately when the transmission reached her. The implications were staggering. This wasn't isolated misconduct. It was systematic. She felt fear rise, followed by something steadier. If they were being separated, monitored, and redirected. It meant they were close. Their next encounter was unplanned and fleeting. Maggie was dispatched forward, under the guise of medical support, after an explosion injured several engineers. Daniel saw her across the clearing, kneeling beside a wounded man, hands steady despite the chaos. Relief hit him unexpectedly hard. When their eyes met, there was no time for words, but in that look was confirmation. Neither of them was imagining this. They were standing on the same fault line, whether they admitted it or not. Captain Hayes arrived shortly after. His presence, immediate and unsettling. He assessed the scene with practiced efficiency, then pulled Maggie aside. His warning this time was explicit. There were limits to inquiry, lines that, once crossed, could not be Maggie listened, heart pounding, then met his gaze evenly. "People are dying," she said simply. Hayes said nothing. The silence between them felt final. That night, Ajax stood watch while Daniel stared into the dark, fully aware that obedience was no longer neutral. Maggie, in her tent, folded her notes into a sealed envelope, unsure if she would ever send it. Above them, flares lit the sky, brief and blinding. Whatever truth Ajax had unearthed had begun to move on its own. And once something buried starts to surface, it never comes up alone. The atmosphere in the sector shifted from controlled tension to something far more dangerous: anticipation. Orders came fragmented now, layered with urgency and contradiction. Daniel noticed how routes changed at the last minute, how certain areas were suddenly labeled secure without explanation. Ajax reacted first, his posture tightening whenever they approached these newly approved paths. The dog's instincts had become Daniel's compass, and that alone marked him as a liability. He could feel eyes on him more often, conversations stopping when he entered a tent. Maggie sensed the same tightening noose. Her movements were logged, her assignments narrowed to the most routine cases, yet it was during those quiet moments, cleaning wounds, sitting beside exhausted soldiers, that she gathered the most truth. Men talked when they were hurting. They spoke of villages cleared too fast, of orders that changed after civilians vanished, of minefields laid where children once played. Maggie wrote everything down later, hands shaking, knowing each word pushed her further past the point of return. The next sweep began before dawn. Fog clung low to the ground, muting sound and depth, turning the world into shifting shadows. Ajax advanced slowly, then stopped short, letting out a low warning whine. Daniel raised his fist, halting the unit. According to the map, the ground ahead was clear. According to Ajax, it was screaming. Daniel chose the dog. He redirected the team, earning sharp looks and whispered curses. Minutes later, an explosion tore through the fog exactly where they would have been. No one argued after that. When Maggie arrived to treat the wounded from a secondary blast, she found Daniel sitting beside Ajax, his hands buried in the dog's thick fur as if grounding himself. Without thinking, she knelt beside him. The closeness felt inevitable now, no longer something either of them resisted. Their shoulders brushed, sending a quiet jolt through them both. In that suspended moment, surrounded by smoke and silence, Maggie understood the depth of Daniel's loyalty, not just to Ajax, but to truth, regardless of cost. Captain Hayes observed them from a distance, his expression hard. Later, he confronted Daniel directly. The conversation was brief, controlled, and laced with threat. Hayes reminded him of duty, of hierarchy, of consequences that extended beyond the battlefield. Daniel listened, then said something that surprised even himself. "If we keep walking where you tell us, more people will die." The words hung heavy between them. Hayes's silence was not agreement. It was calculation. That night, Maggie found Daniel near the perimeter fence. The air was cold, stars sharp. Overhead, she handed him the envelope she had been carrying for days. Inside were names, dates, patterns. Their fingers brushed as he took it, neither pulling away. "If something happens to me," she said quietly, "this needs to survive." Daniel met her gaze, emotion raw and unguarded. Ajax stood alert beside them, ears pricked toward distant movement. Somewhere beyond the darkness, forces were shifting, and for the first time, Maggie and Daniel both understood. Survival was no longer the only thing at stake. The operation scheduled for the following morning arrived wrapped in urgency and silence. No full briefing, no questions invited. Daniel recognized the pattern immediately decisions made elsewhere. Consequences assigned here. The route cut straight through a valley, newly marked as neutralized. A word that felt deliberately vague. Ajax sensed it, too. The dog's movements were tense, deliberate. His focus narrowed in a way Daniel had come to understand as warning. Whatever lay ahead was not simply dangerous. It was intentional. Maggie was assigned forward medical support under the pretense of efficiency. She knew better. Proximity was control. If things went wrong, she would be close enough to manage damage and quiet enough to prevent questions. As trucks rolled out, she caught Daniel's eye from across the clearing. There was no time for conversation, only recognition. The kind that came when two people understood they were walking into something that would change them permanently, whether they survived it or not. The valley swallowed sound. High embankments rose on either side, forcing the convoy into a narrow channel of churned earth and broken stone. Ajax slowed almost immediately, his body rigid, hackles raised. Daniel raised his hand, signaling a halt, but the vehicles behind them pushed forward, momentum overtaking caution. The radio crackled with conflicting commands. Proceed, hold, clear the route. Daniel felt the choice slam into him with brutal clarity. Obega and risk everything Ajax was warning against or defy, and expose himself fully. Ajax broke training and moved laterally, pulling Daniel hard toward the embankment. Shouts erupted. An officer barked orders, then the ground ahead detonated, a controlled blast tearing through the center of the route. The shockwave threw men and metal into chaos. Dust filled the air, screams cutting through the ringing silence. Daniel hit the ground. Ajax pressed against him, unharmed. He knew instantly this explosion had not been random. It had been expected, planned. Captain Hayes arrived with reinforcements, his demeanor calm to the point of cold. He assessed the scene quickly, then ordered containment. Reports were to be restricted, communications limited. Maggie watched him, realization settling like ice in her veins. This was no longer about damage control. It was about erasure. When Hayes met her gaze, there was something like regret there, but not enough to stop him. That night, under cover of exhaustion and darkness, Daniel and Maggie stood beside Ajax at the edge of the valley. The dog was alert, uninjured, unwavering. Daniel understood now what Ajax had been sensing all along, not just danger, but intent buried beneath orders and soil alike. Maggie held the envelope tighter than ever, knowing exposure was imminent. Somewhere in the distance, engines started again. The operation would continue. But so would the truth, and teased time, it would not stay buried. The aftermath of the valley explosion was managed with ruthless efficiency. By sunrise, debris had been cleared, casualties reassigned to anonymous reports, and the route quietly relabeled as compromised by enemy action. Daniel watched it happen with a growing sense of unreality. Ajax stayed close, unusually alert, as if aware that danger now wore a uniform and spoke with authority. Daniel knew they were being watched. Every movement felt measured, every silence recorded. The truth had surfaced, but it was being forced back underground. Maggie felt the pressure immediately. Her access was cut further, her medical unit reassigned to rear operations under the guise of recovery. It was an exile disguised as concern. She packed her supplies with shaking hands, the envelope hidden deep in her bag. Inside were fragments of a story that no single report would ever tell, but together they formed something undeniable. She knew now why the separation was happening. Isolation made people easier to discredit, easier to erase. Daniel was summoned before dusk. The meeting was brief, clinical, He was praised for bravery, commended for composure under fire. Then came the reassignment. Ajax included a different unit, a different purpose, less exposure, less opportunity to interfere. Daniel listened in silence, his pulse steady, his resolve hardening. When he left, he didn't return to his tent. Instead, he went straight to Maggie's, urgency burning through restraint. Their reunion was quiet, but charged. No dramatic embrace. No words spoken at first. They stood inches apart, the war humming around them. Maggie finally broke the silence, telling him about the exile, about Hayes's tightening grip, about how close everything felt to disappearing. Daniel handed her the envelope back, now heavier with added notes, coordinates, confirmations. Their fingers lingered as it passed between them. A moment of connection neither dared name, but both felt deeply. Captain Hayes confronted Daniel one last time before nightfall. This time, there was no pretense. He warned Daniel that continued defiance would have consequences beyond rank or reputation. Men like him, Hayes, he said quietly, didn't end wars, they complicated them. Daniel met his gaze without flinching. Someone has to say where the ground is wrong, he replied. Hayes's expression hardened. The line had been crossed. As darkness fell, Maggie made a decision that terrified her with its clarity. She arranged for the envelope to be duplicated and passed through unofficial channels. Medics, engineers, anyone she trusted. Redundancy was protection. If one copy vanished, another might survive. She worked quickly, knowing time was no longer on her side. Outside, Ajax paced, restless, ears pricked to distant sounds. He had sensed this moment coming. Near midnight, orders arrived that would change everything. A formal inquiry was being initiated, but quietly, internally controlled. Daniel and Ajax were to be held for review. Maggie was to be transferred before dawn. They stood together one last time before the separation, words finally failing them. In that silence was everything they had done, he said, and the knowledge that the next move would decide not just their fate, but whether the truth ever reached the light. Dawn arrived quietly, almost respectfully, as if the world itself understood the weight of what was about to unfold. Daniel sat in a temporary holding area, Ajax lying calmly at his feet. The dog's steady presence, the only thing keeping his thoughts anchored. Guards passed without speaking. No accusations were made, no explanations offered, yet Daniel knew this was not punishment. It was containment. Still, beneath the surface of control, something had shifted. Too many reports existed now. Too many witnesses. The ground they had tried to bury was pushing back. Maggie's transfer was delayed without explanation. Instead of being sent rearward, she was escorted to a provisional command post where unfamiliar officers waited, men and women with no visible allegiance to Hayes' inner circle. They asked precise questions. Dates, locations, names. Maggie answered calmly, sliding copies of the envelope across the table. She expected resistance. What she met instead was silence, the kind that comes when truth finally lands. One officer nodded slowly, as if confirming something long suspected but never proven. The inquiry expanded with quiet inevitability. Not public, not dramatic, but real. Routes were suspended. Units reassigned. Engineers ordered to re-examine cleared ground. Ajax was brought in not as a tool but as evidence. Observers watched in stunned disbelief as the dog reacted consistently to areas previously deemed safe. Patterns emerged, not mistakes. Daniel stood beside Ajax during one such demonstration, feeling a strange mix of pride and sorrow. The dog had done exactly what he was trained to do: protect life. It was people who had failed that purpose. Captain Hayes was relieved of operational command under the language of reassignment. No spectacle followed. No arrest. Just removal. Maggie watched him depart from a distance, his posture rigid, his face unreadable. She felt no triumphantly, a deep, aching exhaustion. Justice in war, she realized, was rarely loud. It was incremental, fragile, but it mattered. Hayes passed her without a word, and for the first time, his silence held no power. Weeks later, the advance resumed along newly cleared routes. Civilian evacuations were prioritized. Reports changed tone. Language softened, then sharpened where it needed to. Daniel and Ajax were reassigned together, officially recognized for their contribution to operational safety. The citation was brief, understated. Daniel didn't care. What mattered was that Ajax would no longer be ignored when he stopped. That listening had become policy, not liability. On a cold evening near the edge of the line, Maggie found Daniel where she always seemed too just beyond the noise. Ajax lay between them, content, finally at ease. They spoke then, not of war or inquiries, but of what came after. There were no promises, only understanding. The war would end someday. The ground would remember. And because one dog refused to move, some truths had survived long enough to matter.